The story of the Labubu doll begins in whispers, in shadows, and in places where curiosity often leads to danger. It is said that the doll was not born out of joy or love, as most toys are, but out of pain and darkness. Many believe it was crafted by an artisan who lived in isolation, a man whose obsession with the spirit world was stronger than his bond with the living. He was not merely a toy maker, he was someone who sought to trap life itself inside lifeless objects. The Labubu doll, small and innocent to the eyes, was one of his creations. But unlike his other works, this doll seemed different. The materials were strange, stitched together with uncanny precision, and the eyes were said to glisten as though they belonged to something real, something alive. The origin of the doll is surrounded by conflicting accounts. Some say the artisan carved it during a period of grief after losing his own child. They claim he poured his sorrow into the doll, whispering lullabies as he worked, hoping to give his lost child a form to return to. Others believe it was created for something far darker, a ritual intended to summon forces beyond human comprehension. It is said that during its creation, chants were heard in the dead of night, candles burned for days, and strange symbols were drawn on the walls of his home. What makes the doll so terrifying is that both stories, one of grief and one of ritual, lead to the same conclusion. The Labubu doll was never ordinary. The earliest owners reported unsettling feelings the moment they touched it. Children would play with the doll and later speak of conversations they had with it. They said the doll whispered secrets and told them stories about people who had already died. Parents dismissed this as childish imagination, until accidents began to happen. Fires with no explanation, mirrors cracking without cause, and the sudden sense of being watched in the stillness of the night. Over time, the doll was passed from one household to another, never staying too long in one place. Families who owned it for too long often faced tragedy. Some abandoned their homes, leaving everything behind except the doll, which always seemed to find its way back. As the stories grew, so did the fear. People began to believe that the Labubu doll was cursed, and not simply because of what it was made of, but because of why it was made. The origin of the Labubu doll remains a chilling mystery, but one thing is certain: its creation was soaked in emotions no child's toy should ever carry. Whether it was grief, anger, or a hunger for power, those feelings clung to the doll, breathing life into its stitched body and giving it a presence that continues to haunt anyone who dares to keep it close. And that, my friends, is where the terror truly begins. The strange experiences surrounding the Labubu doll are perhaps the most unsettling part of its story, because they do not come from myth alone, they come from the living testimonies of those who once dared to keep it in their homes. At first, the doll would seem harmless, sitting quietly on a shelf or a bedside table, its wide, unblinking eyes watching over the room. But soon, small details began to trouble its owners. The doll would be found in a slightly different position than where it had been left. A tilt of the head here, a shift of the arms there, changes so subtle they could easily be dismissed as memory playing tricks. Yet when these small oddities began to repeat night after night, doubt turned to dread. One woman recounted how she left the doll in her daughter's room, only to wake at midnight to the sound of tiny footsteps running across the wooden floor. When she rushed to check, her daughter was fast asleep, but the doll had moved from the bed to the window, its head turned toward the moonlit sky. Another family claimed to hear faint whispers whenever the house grew silent, a voice too soft to understand, but chilling enough to freeze the blood in their veins. Some swore that the whispers carried their names, repeated again and again in the darkness, as though the doll was calling to them. Animals, too, seemed disturbed in its presence. Cats would hiss and claw at the air around the doll, dogs would whimper and refuse to enter the room where it sat, and birds kept in cages would panic, flapping violently against their bars whenever the doll was near. Owners began to notice that the air grew colder around it, and sometimes, even in the height of summer, a chilling drought seemed to surround the doll's resting place. The experiences only grew darker with time. Several owners reported violent nightmares, dreams in which they were trapped in endless halls, chased by a small shadowy figure with glowing eyes that looked eerily like the doll's. Others claimed to wake in the middle of the night, paralyzed, unable to move, while the doll sat at the foot of their bed, staring silently at them. One man said he awoke with scratches across his chest, as though small hands had clawed at him while he slept. He lived alone, and the only thing in his bedroom was the Labubu doll. Children, however, were the most affected. They treated the doll not as a toy but as a companion, insisting it spoke to them when adults were not around. Some even grew aggressive when parents tried to take it away, screaming that the doll would be angry. One chilling account tells of a boy who drew pictures of himself holding the doll's hand, but in every picture, the doll was much larger than him, towering over his small figure. The strange experiences became impossible to dismiss as imagination or coincidence. Too many families, across different towns and times, told the same stories. No matter where it traveled, the Labubu doll left behind a trail of fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. It was no longer just an eerie toy, it was something alive, something watching, and something no one could truly escape. The turning point in the Labubu doll's story is where unease transformed into undeniable terror, when strange experiences no longer lingered in the realm of coincidence but crossed into life-altering, tragic events. For years, families had whispered of odd happenings and eerie disturbances, but there came a time when the doll's presence brought consequences so severe that even skeptics were silenced. This was the moment people stopped thinking of it as just an unsettling toy and began to regard it as a cursed object, as something far more dangerous than folklore could explain. One of the earliest recorded incidents involved a family of 4 who had inherited the doll from a distant relative. At first, they laughed off its reputation, treating it as nothing more than a creepy antique, but within weeks, the atmosphere in their home began to change. Arguments erupted daily, tempers flared without reason, and the once harmonious family seemed to be tearing itself apart. One night, the father claimed he saw the doll standing in the hallway, though he was certain no one had placed it there. He tried to dismiss it, but later that evening a fire broke out in the house under mysterious circumstances. Though the family survived, their home was destroyed, and the only object found untouched in the ashes was the Labubu doll, sitting upright amidst the ruins. That incident marked the first time the doll's reputation escalated from strange to dangerous. Other tragedies soon followed. In another household, a young girl who had grown unusually attached to the doll began waking with deep scratches on her arms. Doctors dismissed it as sleepwalking or self-inflicted wounds, but the marks grew worse with time. Then, without warning, the child vanished from her locked bedroom one night. The room showed no signs of forced entry, the windows were bolted shut, and yet she was gone. The only thing left behind was the Labubu doll, sitting in the middle of the bed, its eyes reflecting the faint glow of the nightlight. Despite desperate searches, the girl was never found, and the case remains unsolved to this day. These were not isolated incidents. Reports poured in from different towns of sudden deaths, inexplicable accidents, and families abandoning their homes in fear. A priest who was called to cleanse one of the houses fainted after entering the room where the doll was kept. He later said that he felt 1,000 eyes watching him, and when he regained consciousness, the doll had somehow moved from its shelf to the chair beside him. Even seasoned investigators began refusing to examine the doll after hearing its history, claiming they could not risk bringing such energy into their own lives. The turning point in the Labubu doll's story was clear. It was no longer a matter of eerie disturbances, but of survival. It was no longer about a doll shifting places or whispers in the dark. It was about lives lost, homes destroyed, and futures stolen. From that moment on, no one could deny that this was not just an object of fear, but a vessel of malevolence. The Labubu doll had crossed a line, and those who encountered it would never again be the same. The unexplainable events tied to the Labubu doll are what truly cemented its place as one of the most disturbing stories of supernatural horror. While strange experiences and tragic turning points already terrified those who heard of it, the events that followed defied every attempt at explanation. Psychologists, priests, scientists, and even skeptics tried to uncover the truth behind the doll, but each encounter only deepened the mystery, leaving behind more questions than answers. It was as though the doll thrived on resisting human understanding, mocking every effort to contain it. One of the most chilling incidents involved a group of paranormal investigators who took the Labubu doll into their care. Determined to prove or debunk the tales surrounding it, they set up cameras, voice recorders, and thermal sensors inside a controlled room where the doll sat alone. For hours, nothing happened. But at exactly midnight, the footage showed the doll tilting its head ever so slightly, followed by a complete blackout of all equipment. When power was restored minutes later, the doll was no longer sitting on the chair up. It was on the other side of the room, positioned directly in front of the main camera. None of the investigators admitted to moving it, and the footage between the blackout and restoration was irretrievably corrupted. Every attempt to analyze the tapes ended in technical failure, as though the evidence itself refused to exist. In another case, a family attempted to seal the doll away in a locked wooden chest. After experiencing weeks of disturbances, they nailed the chest shut and stored it in their attic. But the next morning, the chest was found downstairs in the living room, wide open, with the doll sitting on the couch as though it had been waiting for them. No locks were broken, no nails removed, and the chest was still intact. It was simply empty. To this day, no one can explain how the doll moved. There were also unexplainable instances involving technology. Phones would ring in the middle of the night, and when answered, static voices whispered words that sounded eerily like the names of the doll's owners. Computers shut down when files about the doll were saved. Cameras pointed as the doll captured only static, or worse, strange shadowy figures hovering behind it that disappeared the moment the footage was replayed. Some researchers even claimed the doll interfered with their dreams, causing identical nightmares across multiple people who had never spoken to one another. Dreams of endless dark corridors and the sound of tiny footsteps following close behind. Perhaps the most unnerving detail about these events is that no one could ever destroy the doll. Attempts were made at burning, cutting, even burying it deep in the earth, but each time, the doll would resurface, unharmed, and often closer than before to those who had tried to rid themselves of it. One priest, after attempting to cleanse it with holy rites, reported that every candle in the church blew out at once, leaving the entire congregation in darkness. When the lights returned, the doll was no longer where it had been placed, but instead sat on the altar, facing the priest directly. The unexplainable events surrounding the Labubu doll serve as a terrifying reminder that not all mysteries can be solved. Some forces exist beyond human understanding, immune to science, resistant to faith, and unbound by the rules of reality. With the Labubu doll, every attempt to find answers only reveals more darkness, as if the doll itself is determined to keep its secrets forever. The endless mystery of the Labubu doll is perhaps the most haunting part of its story, because despite decades of encounters, investigations, and whispered warnings, no one has ever truly understood what it is or what it wants. Unlike other cursed objects whose histories can often be traced back to a single ritual or tragedy, the Labubu doll remains shrouded in unanswered questions. Every attempt to pin down its origin, purpose, or limits has only deepened the sense of dread surrounding it. It is not just a doll anymore, it is a legend, a presence, a shadow that refuses to fade. What makes the mystery so unsettling is the doll's ability to defy explanation. People who have tried to study it cannot agree on whether it is possessed by a spirit, cursed by dark magic, or perhaps something much older and far more sinister. Some researchers suggest it acts as a veil, a bridge between the world of the living and the dead. Others believe it is not a vessel at all but a being in its own right, using the form of a doll as camouflage, hiding behind its childlike appearance to lure victims into a false sense of safety. And then there are those who whisper an even darker theory, that the doll is not tied to the supernatural but to something outside our comprehension altogether, something not of this world. The most frightening part of the mystery lies in the fact that the Labubu doll never seems to die, never weakens, and never disappears for long. Families who have tried to get rid of it find it reappearing years later in the most unexpected places. Even museums and collectors who once stored it under lock and key eventually lost track of it, reporting that it simply vanished without signs of theft. Each time it disappears, rumors spread of it resurfacing in another country, another home, another family's nightmare. It seems to wander freely, as though it chooses its next destination, its next victim. Adding to the mystery are the stories that follow those who have merely seen the doll, not even owned it. Some witnesses claimed they began to dream of it afterward, as if a simple glance was enough to draw its attention. Others spoke of strange knocks on their doors at night, even though they never took the doll into their homes. This has led many to believe that the Labubu doll does not need to be touched or owned to spread its curse. Merely acknowledging its existence might be enough to invite its gaze. And so the questions remain unanswered and haunting. What is the true nature of the Labubu doll? Why does it seek out new victims? What keeps it alive through time and across borders? No priest, no scientist, and no investigator has ever solved the puzzle. Perhaps the greatest horror of the Labubu doll is not in the scratches, whispers, or disappearances it causes, but in the gnawing silence of not knowing. Humanity cannot fight what it cannot understand, and the Labubu doll thrives in that void of knowledge. The mystery endures, and with it, the fear. For as long as the Labubu doll exists, there will be stories whispered in the dark, families too afraid to speak of what they have seen, and children who swear their toy is alive. And perhaps, even as you listen now, the Labubu doll is already on its way to another home, ready to add another chapter to a story that will never truly end.